planning is core to what a CFO does. Accounting, bookkeeping is like recording what has happened in the past. CFOs are helping you plan the futures. We got to get these things straight. There's three. It's forecast, projection, and budget.
I have nothing against daily forecasting.
Waste of time. Dylan, we're back, man. Episode 23. We're almost to our half year celebration. When we get to 26, we might have to have like a half year anniversary. What's happening, man?
Yeah, I was on a walk earlier today, just breaking up my day outside. Beautiful weather in Toronto right now, and I was thinking to myself, like, damn, we've had a good number of these pods now. We're gonna blink and we're gonna be at pod number 50. It's going by so quick.
Yeah, man. I don't know how many people watch the YouTube versus like listen on one of the other apps, but if you're watching on YouTube, you're seeing Jon who hasn't shaved
you look great.
on Monday morning. So this is the unshaved, uncensored version, episode 23. We're chatting today about the planning processes that elite D2C brands follow. Dylan, obviously ops or like finance, ops, marketing, very interwoven, but you on the agency side of the world, us on the fractional CFO side of the world, we get asked all the time to be involved in planning. So to get us started, what is some of the most frequent requests you get about being involved in planning process?
As I'm thinking about how to answer that, this is the dense one.
Yeah, for sure.
Going from like top down, I'd say that oftentimes at some point in Q3 or Q4, we start getting looped into conversations about annual planning for the upcoming year.
Yeah.
That's usually more common for bigger, more established brands and or brands with longer lead times on inventory and or longer lead times on net new product development. So that's definitely kind of like the most common one. And then when you break it out from there, we obviously do our forecasting work. So that's getting updated on some rolling basis. And for most brands, that's going to be updated on like a rolling like 3 to 12 month window into the future. So from a planning standpoint, there's that. But then it kind of gets broken out into like kind of these like tangents. So there's a difference between like forecast and desired outcome. So like ideally, if it's easiest when we basically say we think the most likely scenario is this, and your goal is also that. There's not much of a delta. Where kind of like these kind of tangents can arise, where the planning can kind of open up into a sea of infinite possibilities, is if forecast is often below the plan. I guess if forecast is beyond the plan, that's a whole other can of worms too. I think oftentimes though people's ambitions outpace the current kind of trajectory of things. That tends to get into like product development planning and like what are the things or the levers we can pull. And that kind of is a whole other beast, but that's kind of the most common kind of things we'll get pulled into. How about you guys on the CFO side?
Yeah, I mean, obviously a lot, right? Like planning is core to what a CFO does because a lot of brands, when they come to us, maybe they've had accounting. Some of them had a CFO before, but most of them have record keeping, right? Accounting, bookkeeping, which is like recording what has happened in the past. But we always tell them like one of the ways to think about the distinction between a CFO and an accountant is CFOs are helping you plan the future. So it very much is the essence of what a CFO should be doing. And so we get involved in a few different planning cadences that have different time horizons. So there's kind of like a hierarchy. There's the annual planning cycle, the quarterly planning cycle, the monthly planning cycle, and then there's some sort of like, it's not always weekly, but some sort of pacing check-in, right? Intra-month pacing check-in. A lot of times brands that are using some sort of an annual planning framework will use something like EOS or the like, or like a modified EOS system. We don't participate in all of the like by the book, like annual and quarterly planning, like EOS, like meetings and everything, but we definitely help them inform the numbers that they're going to forecast on their, P&L. A lot of times it's their targets or what you were calling their desired outcome. As well as like measuring other key measurables that maybe aren't specifically a P&L line item, in alignment with their planning. But you were talking about something. I actually want to dive into each of those time horizons a little bit further with you to talk a little bit more tactically about like how really, how you call it elite brands or just well operated brands think about planning within each of those time horizons. But you mentioned something a second ago when you were talking that I want to double click into first. It's definitions, the definitions of a couple key terms that we got to get these things straight, because if we don't get these things straight, it doesn't matter what planning process you're talking about. One person may be talking about apples while another one's talking about oranges. So there's three. It's forecast, projection, and budget. You kind of talked about desired outcome and forecast. Obviously I've got some thoughts on these, but let's double click into that first, because I think forecast and projection are probably the two that get used interchangeably incorrectly. When you were saying forecast earlier, as opposed to desired outcome, what do you mean by forecast?
Yeah, so forecast would basically be a projection or a set of projections built around historical data to inform what we think is likely to occur into the future. And traditionally, one of those forecasts would be like the base case. Sometimes we'll have multiple versions of a forecast just for like risk management planning to the upside or the downside, or most frequently on product mix stuff. So like, for example, like we've had some situations in the past where we're expecting to get X amount of product before a big event, but it may not come in time. So what happens? So that's like a scenario, but it's built around historical data. So it's like base case around an if statement. I like to use the word scenario planning a lot. I think I use that instead of the word projection. But like sometimes we'll send a client like, hey, hypothetically, if you just always had this new customer ROAS based off your cohorts, what would happen? And we'll frequently do that. Let's say a brand has like a 4x new customer ROAS, some insane outcome, but they have like great LTV, kind of like showing them how a different new customer ROAS outcomes, how volume can supplement via the LTV. And then budget is basically like the other piece, which is more so how much do you plan on spending for a specific period of time, which I actually don't even like really setting. I'm not a big believer in like fixed budgets.
We should have an episode about that, because I think you and I were talking about that maybe last week or something. That's a whole nother episode, but I think we were talking about I'd
rather talk about constraints than budgets. Like what is like the number of units you can sell before you run out? That is more important to me than budget. But anyways, those are kind of the three, right? So I'm curious if you agree with that or if you have any other takes.
Yeah, I agree. And I'll just kind of like go a little bit deeper into each one of those. So like forecast is what we think will actually happen given what we know today. So to draw out a couple things you said, data driven, right? Historical data. There's a book I read. I think I mentioned this recently on another episode, Future Ready. I'll probably like between now and episode 26, when we hit our semi-annual anniversary, I'm going to probably talk about Future Ready multiple times again, because conceptually there's some really powerful stuff in there. And it talks about a forecast being the unbiased, most likely outcome, right? Unbiased, meaning that you haven't biased the data set. Because the key thing is that like mathematically, you can use historical data, but you can use a biased, right, data set. Go read Future Ready or ask ChatGPT to talk to you about data bias, because that's outside the scope of this episode. But you can have a data-driven forecast that's biased, and a forecast should be unbiased. What that basically means is, high level, you should over forecast the same number of, just as frequently as you under forecast. If you're consistently over forecasting or under forecasting, then, more than the other, then you probably have bias in your data. So that's forecast. Think, classic forecast is the weather report. Projection is what could happen under certain assumptions and scenarios. Like Dylan said, hypothetical, that's the if then. And what is key is, I think the reason why they get interchanged so often is because you do actually have to do both, right? Simultaneously, especially in ecom, because you may have an unbiased data driven forecast, which is the unbiased most likely outcome, but that the past doesn't always predict the future in ecom because things change so frequently. So you think about that again, Future Ready talks about that being what they call the momentum forecast, the unbiased data-driven momentum forecast of the data. And then they have this piece called the intervention forecast. That's the projection layer. So you layer on, well, if we intervene on the momentum forecast, right, by doing this, then this is what would happen. If we intervene in this way, then this is what happens. So the reason I personally think in ecom, you have to use them together, but you have to be clear about saying this piece is the forecast and this piece is the projection, and combined the projected outcome is this. And then budget is, this is what we're planning to do, or this is what we're planning to allocate. This is the allocation of resources we're planning on doing to hit our forecast or projection. And it's more of an accountability thing, right? So like budget is the contract, like the contract we've made with ourselves. Forecast is like the weather report, a prediction based on data. Projection is the what if simulation. So I just want to say that because this is key before we get into talking about these different planning time horizons. So let's talk annual first. When we're talking about setting an annual plan, and let's maybe even talk about annual and quarterly together. When you guys are working on some of the sort of longer range, or like, you know, in this case, 3 to 12 month plans, what are some of the key best practices, or even on the flip side, some of the traps you see brands fall into in your experience?
Yeah. So I think that out of the gate, a few things. It's easier to forecast with a higher degree of accuracy, high LTV brands, just because that type of revenue, return customer revenue, is easier. So I think that it really depends what size of brand you're talking about. If you're like doing between like 5 million and like low 8 figures and you're super first time customer dominant, I think it's really, really tough to accurately forecast on an annualized basis, especially if you're forecasting like 100% year over year growth in ad spend, because the incrementality of spend is not linear, and it's difficult to estimate what your performance will look like, assuming you're doing the same or a similar offer at double the volume. That's not to say you can't try, and this is why there has to be error bars on a forecast. But
Definitely.
when you deliver a base case, one should communicate that this base case is of lower quality than, say, forecasts for a brand that have more durable revenue via that return customer revenue. So that's,
I
like,
want to say
one.
something on this really quick, because we just experienced this not that long ago. We have a high LTV subscription supplements brand that we work with, and they had their Meta account shut off for a couple weeks. They ran into an issue. It actually, I think, ended up being 3 or 4 weeks, but their CFO on our team was actually able to forecast using their LTV data that this is going to actually, the number of new customers they missed out on acquiring during that period, because they basically just lived off their LTV piggy bank during that time, stopped acquiring new customers more or less. She was able to forecast that out for like the rest of the year and say, this probably puts us behind our revenue goal for the year by 15 to 20%. And I can show you where that revenue is not going to show up in the future based on our LTV. That is so much, that intel is like so much different and more helpful and actionable. And I would even say predictive than, hey, we're a new customer dominant brand. We missed out on, 3 to 4 weeks of new customer acquisition in April, but Q4 is our biggest time every single year. Yeah. And this may have little to no impact on that, right?
Yeah, because you can also just go and make up for it by spending more money the next month. And even if you're like slightly less efficient, because you're basically making up for a lost 3 weeks spread out across the next 2 months, it's like, it may not even matter if the LTV is good enough. Like some of the CAC to LTVs on these replenishables, especially when you're relatively small, so like low 8 figures, you can, it's not ideal, but it's not the same when you're dealing with like very strict first time customer contribution margin requirements. So yeah, I think that makes total sense. The other thing is, like, the further you forecast into the future, you're basically and this is on the flip side, when you're more LTV dominant, you're estimating LTV growth on a forecasted first time customer growth. So if you are wrong to the upside or downside, and you're wrong consistently, that compounds. Now, that's why you update these things every single month or every single quarter or every single week, whatever time frame is reasonable. But there's some scenario, there's some variability here. It's like the easiest businesses and the ones where these workflows I think are like the easiest to manage would be like high LTV, high margin, and like relatively short lead times on inventory. It's good to have an annual plan because you have to like back into a strategy to deploy it. But I think annual plans are kind of built for quarterly adjustments. But I think, yeah, like general rule of thumb is for the longer term planning, it's easier to do high LTV as long as you're continuously updating it on those quarterly or monthly check-ins.
Okay, so there's a couple things that you made me think of as you were going through these longer time horizons, annual, and touching on quarterly a little bit. Longer time horizon, the further out in the future that you're forecasting, from a finance perspective, it's more of a capacity planning exercise than a tactical decision-making tool. Unless during COVID, your 90-day lead times ballooned to 14 months and you had to actually make a tactical decision reliant on a forecast that was 14 months out. But that's why so many brands got in over their head with buying too much inventory, right? But the point I'm making is you have to really ask yourself, this is so key. And again, read Future Ready, because that book really opened my eyes to this, is that like, just because you're forecasting a certain time horizon doesn't mean you have to make a decision on it today. And that's not, the point is to say, what is the time horizon within which I have to make a tactical decision, like say, hire someone or issue a PO for inventory, versus a more strategic, I'd say the further out in the future, the more it's strategic and you're thinking about capacity. So you're thinking about, if we did get to that number 12 months from now, would our factory be able to actually like, do they have enough capacity? Does our 3PL have enough capacity? Does 100%. Our line of credit facility have enough capacity on it to purchase that much? So it's more of like oh, hey, this is what would have to be true resource wise for us to make this happen. But then let's zoom back into whatever for most brands, it's what's our lead time, our total lead time from PO to receiving inventory, whatever that time horizon is, 90 days, 120 days. That's the one that you should scrutinize more, like with your marketing team on the demand forecast or with your finance team on the cash forecast, because you're going to commit to decisions today that are going to have ramifications over that time period.
Yeah. And like operationally, if you're thinking about what's going to be true 12 months from now, like from a capacity standpoint, do you have to basically plan on hiring more people? Basically identify the constraints and then identify when in the year you have to go and basically get ahead of it and tackle it so that by the end of the year or whatever arbitrary time frame, you're set up so that constraint no longer exists. Another word I'd use it is like you're trying to estimate what are the constraints that I'm going to hit when I have that volume. And the benefit of the full year forecast is you can estimate when you're going to hit those constraints, so you can stay ahead of the ball and actually try to make sure you're knocking those constraints out of the way, so you never get stuck. Because if you're wrong and you get there sooner, which there's worse things than growing too fast, but like if you get there too fast, you might then get stuck. I've seen brands, great CAC to LTV, maybe they're vertically integrated, and you kind of just got to sit and wait for like 6 months as they get the next like supply line online, or they hire for this or that, or like they buy a new warehouse, or like whatever it is. It's like a good problem, but it's one that maybe could have been avoided with better planning.
Totally. So, one other thing I just want to say about annual before we talk more about quarterly and monthly in more detail. I like set an annual plan. I do think it's helpful, by the way. Like, we do it for our business. I think I recommend that brands do it. But like, I'm starting to become more and more like, hey, let's not hold it with like a real tight fist, right? Let's have more of a loose hold on that annual plan, and maybe even like be open-handed about it. And it's because you may find you will find certain things are true or are not true along the way. And so this is actually the segue to quarterly for me. I believe an annual plan. And part of this comes from EOS. I'm an EOS guy, was an EOS coach formerly, ran Guardian on it. We run Free to Grow on it. Like, quarterly is not just setting the 90-day kind of milestones to advance your annual plan. It's also your chance to reflect on the annual plan and say, what did we learn? What actually happened versus what we thought was going to happen? What needs to be changed? How do we, and honestly, especially in ecom, especially if you're growing fast and you're evolving fast, a lot of times it's like, hey, we need to change our annual plan. And I'm not suggesting you just change it constantly, but I do think that in general, fast growing businesses, the owners and founders and executive team need to be okay with tweaking things, especially when you're in the lower to middle market, because you're not this big behemoth business that is like kind of peaked, right? And you're just harvesting. You're flying the plane as you're building it, right?
Well, I feel like there's like probably something to be said around the lines of like, if you're like a big established entity, or you're running like a more like boring business and you're just compounding between like 20 and 40% a year, 20 and 30% a year, which is still very fast growth, by the way, especially at big numbers, maybe even say 10 to 20% a year, whatever. Like it's easier to plan around that with a lot of historical data and have an annual plan that you can actually stick to versus a business that's only been around for 2 years, doing between like 5 and 20 million, and you're planning on doubling. It's like, well, you don't have that much historical data to go off of.
Totally.
And it's almost like there's way more growth ahead of you than there is behind you. Totally. At least on like a short-term time horizon. So I think that's a great way to put it. There's some entities that are just built for annual planning. It doesn't mean don't do it. It's still productive. An example of why it's still important, I'll say this, is let's say you have a great CAC to LTV, but you lose money in acquisition. If you set quarterly targets to maximize the quarter, you could miss out on a ton of contribution margin dollars.
Totally.
So like you still have to do all the above. I think it's like from a planning perspective, as an executive, it's your responsibility to look at all of them and assign which ones you care the most about time frame wise. And it's about striking a balance between the objectives you have across the time frames.
Agree. And that's why we're skipping ahead a little bit, but I think this is a perfect time to talk about it. This is why we don't do annual. In school, they call it static budgeting. That's like the old school, like you work for a big, super big public company that's like on the S&P 500 or something. They set their annual plan. They send it to analysts. That's the plan that they got to hit or beat for their stock price to do well, right? And that's like your job is to hit that and you get your bonus, right? We're not in that world in the 7, 8, 9 figure ecom brand space. Like we're closely held businesses, a lot of times bootstrapped, founder funded. Like your destiny is up to you. The board you report to is yourself and your partners or your co-founders, right? And so like we do rolling forecasting, right? Which means that when we look at our financial model, the projection of the future, depending on we go as far as 24 months, but the standard is like at least the next 12 months. We have an annual plan that we like freeze in our financial model so that we can measure against how well we set that annual plan. But if you have a 12-month projection with us, we'll always roll it forward 12 months. So we're always looking forward 12 months from today or from the most recent month. And that's because when you do static budgeting, amongst other issues, every company that does static budgeting, it's like in like September, October, they're working their butts off to like figure out the next year's budget, and they're working cross-functionally and they're negotiating on who's going to get what expenses and whatever, right? But they have no visibility beyond December of that year until that budget is done. It's like everything, like it's like the world is flat and you just fall off, right? And so rolling planning, whether that's whatever your time horizon is, means that every month you move it forward one more month. And so you almost never reach the destination, which in my opinion, my take, you don't. Like the annual plan is really just to give you a sense of where you're at compared to last year, right? In many ways. Like at the end of the day, when you're running a closely held business, like the ones we're working with, you don't ever reach the end, right? And so it is good to always continue to have that, it's about different perspectives, right? Like you want to see forward, you want to have the same amount of visibility looking forward every month, and you don't want it to become less and less every month. But at the same time, freezing an annual plan is great because it gives you another perspective of progress. So it's about just looking at all these different perspectives and understanding where they fit in the assessment of the business performance. And most importantly, does that perspective actually trigger a decision or not yet? Right. That's where I see most people get tripped up, is that they trigger a decision on the wrong time horizon, like forward-looking plan.
On the daily forecast, Jon. That is, that's a whole other beast. I'm actually curious your thoughts on this. Have you guys ever had to put together like a daily forecast? I have a very hard opinion on this. There's a few instances where I'm okay with it.
Okay. So My take, waste of time. Like waste of time. And now I will tell you, I do have a couple exceptions. Okay. And mind you, the waste of time, my strongly held belief on this comes from doing it and seeing it was a waste of time. So like, this is like firsthand experience. This is not like, hey, I just don't want to get into that. Here's why. There's a lot of reasons why, but one of the biggest ones is it causes brands to act too quickly on normal day-to-day fluctuations, largely in ad spend efficiency and revenue. So I'm sure
it's a human problem.
Yeah. And now I will tell you this, here's where it's helpful, but even what I'm about to say right now, I will even modify it. The true daily is not that helpful. I like to always look in at least 7-day increments to smooth out the season. I call it daily seasonality. That's probably the wrong word to use, but like the daily fluctuation that's normal in ad performance, right? The one time a year that for some brands, if we can project their cash is going to be really tight, we will sometimes activate it from like October 15th to whenever their Black Friday, Cyber Monday sale starts. And the only reason we do that is because cash is projected to get so tight that we're really like threading the needle on making sure. We know they're going to be fine when they get to the sale, but it may be a little sketchy before then. But even then, a weekly cash plan is probably sufficient, but that's really the only time. But I'm interested in hearing your take.
Yeah, we get asked this like a decent amount. It's usually from the brands who are the most cash strapped, and that usually are the brands who are smaller. So either like mid 7 figures, below 8 figures. And basically the desire is that because literally every day's cash flow in is so critical to just making basic expenses, like whether it be payroll, et cetera, there's like a hyper fixation on shorter timeframes. And I think that that's one side of it. The other side of it is just like people get obsessive over data and information for the sake of information. And I'm a big believer in when you give someone a metric or a data point or anything, you're saying that I think this is relevant enough for you to review and give an opinion on it.
Totally.
And the truth is I have nothing against daily forecasting. I think if you want to use software and AI to make hourly forecasting, that's cool too. The question is the person you're then going to give it to expected to make a decision about it or give an opinion?
That's the key. That's the key. That's the key. It's not, but the problem is the human nature is
they want
to meddle with the system to make a decision on the frequency with which the data is showing up. And that's the problem. So you have to define on the front end whenever anyone has asked me this, I've always said, we need to define on the front end where are we drawing the line. And the line I'm talking about is the line where we're going to make a decision. We've crossed the line and we're going to intervene. Right. Yeah. And, so anyways, we're on the same page about that. I did want to, I want to ask you about, this is actually a good time to segue into this. I think, we're sort of skipping past monthly, although we've already talked about several concepts around monthly. I want to talk about Intra-Month, right? Mm-hmm. We said daily is too frequent for numerous reasons. What are your thoughts on like intra-month frequency of planning check-ins? From my perspective, it's really a pacing check-in, right? It's a pacing and intra-month adjustment check-in. Where do you see the frequency that is helpful from a reporting standpoint versus an take action standpoint? Yeah.
So usually like sometime mid-month, we'll do a like very thorough review of like how things are pacing. And if there's anything that looks like it's going to be like very off, we'll basically call out, hey, like this is not pacing well. Let's make a change. We also look at it on a week-to-week basis, but like the mid-month check-in is kind of a more thorough review of like, like if you have a bad week, sometimes it's just a bad week. Maybe you sent fewer emails that week and the next week is expected to be better. So I think the midway point is important. Yeah. And then once you're there, you can basically establish, okay, do I need to add more email sends? Am I just accepting that I'm not going to hit target for X, Y, or Z reason? Am I pacing above? Do I have enough inventory if I do achieve this outcome? And then from there, you can basically decide what changes, if any, need to be made based off of the pacing. And then if you do choose to change the expectation, maybe because you're going to beat by a bunch or miss by a lot, do you just kind of reforecast for the month as a whole, just so you have like a base expectation for the back half? So usually it's like a pretty thorough mid-month check, but then also with week-to-week check-ins, just with like rough metrics.
For sure. Yeah, I would say, look, in various different departments or teams within the business, there are needs for different weekly check-ins. But the question is, what's the key planning check-in? Like when you talk about the integrated planning, I hate saying that because that's what they call it in school, is like integrated planning. That just means I've decided to call it cross-functional planning. That just means when marketing and ops and finance get together to talk about decisions that need to be made, and all three of those seats or those functions need to be represented, right? So like at Guardian Bikes, we had this thing that we called the cross-functional planning meeting. It's like that's straight up what it was. That was what I came up with. That it's like cross-functional planning meeting right there on the Google Meets. You're like, what is this, right? And so but literally it was like, how are we pacing? How is our sales pacing versus our expectations, really against our financial model, which is what we used to make financial decisions? What does the latest look like for PO arrivals? So, because like, you always have an expectation of delivery dates for inventory, and it never gets delivered exactly when you think. So it's like, how are we selling versus our financial model? How are PO arrivals coming in against our financial model? Then what's the latest that the inventory team, whoever owns replenishment planning, what's their latest thoughts on PO requests? Like I want to purchase this, right? And then the finance team does like a cash flow check, and it's like usually the deliverables out of that meeting or the actions are like, yes, you are clear to place that PO, or finance is going to get back to you in the next day or two to run a few different projections to let you know like where the guardrail should be on purchases. And so I think that should happen once a month. And now there are some brands that need to do it more frequently. It does come down to the pace at which decisions need to be made. Say the average brand once a month is fine. Some brands that are in more critical, like when we were in the middle of COVID, we were doing this every single week because every week our PO arrival schedule was changing. Every week our sales forecast was way off, or our sales pace was way off from our forecast. All the variables are changing. We had to make decisions all the time. So we had to meet weekly, figure out what works for your team, and make sure you bring those people to the table. Finance, marketing, ops. It doesn't have to be every person on the team. It just has to be a representative, right? And that's how you make sure you kind of have a cross-functional check ultimately before you purchase inventory, is really what it comes down to. I am curious to get your thoughts. So I have this opinion that the faster a brand is growing, and I actually think this is general too, it doesn't have to be a brand, but the faster a business is growing, the more frequently goals need to be set for a shorter time period. So for example, a very slow moving business or a very slow growing business or steady growing business can set goals for a year and maybe not set any new goals, just work on those all throughout the year. A business that's growing faster than that needs to set goals every quarter and for a 90-day period. Some businesses that are growing gangbusters fast need to just set goals for the month and work on them for 30 days and then meet again to set goals again. And the reason being, the faster you're growing, the more things are changing. Like I worked with a brand, one of my first clients, we went from 1.8 million to 34 million in a 12-month period. And we couldn't set goals for longer than a few weeks. We had to like work on an initiative and a sprint and then come back together and talk about everything we learned and switch the goals up. But anyways, what are your thoughts on like frequency of setting like goals, priorities, OKRs, whatever you want to call them, versus growth rate?
Yeah, I think that the reason why that's a true statement is because the reason why planning exists in the first place is you're trying to identify constraints before they happen. So like, for example, let's just pretend like we're teleporting back to the early 2010s, mid 2010s, the beginning of the drop shipping era when you could just run Facebook ads with a product and not have much logistics to worry about. In theory, as long as that product existed with enough quantity, like what was the constraint, right? Like, I guess that was the constraint, but like there wasn't very many operational constraints that would exist. And the cash flow planning for a dropshipping business is very simple because you're not buying inventory in advance, et cetera, et cetera. So planning doesn't necessarily need to be that complex. Nowadays, in like 2025, when you're scaling an ecom business, there's a lot more logistics and things to worry about and think about because it's rare that the dropshipping model is going to be as effective. And in these scenarios, there's way more things that can break as you scale. And with effective planning, you can try to basically see around the corner and identify when things break. But inevitably, you're not going to see around the corner with like 2020 vision and get all these things right. So because you're scaling so fast, you're gonna probably hit some constraints, and these constraints are going to be pain points that you have to kind of work around. Maybe an example of a really frustrating one is like my supplier literally cannot make more because they need to invest in like more equipment and they don't want to. Like that sucks. Like, well, what are you going to do then? Like that's a painful thing to get around. Maybe you didn't see that one coming. And then on the flip side of it too is back to my earlier point. It's just harder to forecast a business that is growing really, really rapidly because you are trying to use historical data to make an informed decision about the future. But if you're going from like 10 million in sales to 50 million in sales, some of the financial metrics of your business are just going to look way different in terms of CAC and LTV at 50 million than what it looked like at 5. So there's just the error bars increase when you're scaling at that rate because you're not even getting some of the data to then update the forecast and the expectation because of how fast you're growing. So those are a few things that come to mind, but I like totally agree on that, Jon.
That's very well put. And I was just thinking as you were talking that when you hit constraints, the historical relationship between different data points breaks and they're no longer useful predictors because you've reached a constraint and you're like, okay, now I've got to act on this outside of the data paradigm I had before this. So last question I want to ask you, because I have a very strongly held belief about this. Are budget versus actuals a waste of time or useful? And if they're useful, in what way?
I think the value in that is it's more of an opportunity to review accountability. So like if you are wildly right or wrong as a executive who did not make that forecast, it's an opportunity to kind of catch that and talk about why was it right or wrong and by how much? And does that inform a change in either how you basically go about forecasting these things or something else has to change?
Totally.
Alternatively, like how does it impact the the next month? Probably not much because your actual is your actual and that's what you have to deal with. But I think it's more of like a managerial item than it is a immediately productive exercise. That's kind of my answer to that. What do you think?
Yeah. So I agree with that. And additionally, I'll say, and you kind of touched on this, but it's like, one, there's an accountability aspect to it, but what's more important is not beating someone down over like overrunning their budget. It's more of a learning exercise. Why did this happen? And I would say furthermore, the second thing, and I actually think this is more important. This is where it's important to us at Free to Grow CFO. We do a budget versus actual, but not to go beat up the owners of every P&L line. We do it to inform, do we have the right model assumptions going forward? And so like on the variable cost side, how close did we get to our variable cost forecast? And where did we get surprised? So for example, I'll just give you like a very practical example. Shipping cost was way high as a percentage of revenue for a brand like budget versus actual that I was doing this for not that long ago. And you know what I found? I found that it was October of last year. They had shipped a ton of stuff from their 3PL to Amazon FBA. So it all got booked in that particular month. Was that a bad decision? No, we all agreed that strategically they should get inventory right out to FBA, but we actually missed modeling that properly in the P&L. And so this year, when I'm rolling their projections like in a couple days, they're going to have a bigger shipping cost as a percentage of revenue for Amazon, but it's coming from their 3PL, which is counterintuitive because we learned about this cost driver that wasn't inherent in our typical day-to-day unit economics by channel. And so things like that are valuable learnings for getting better at planning, but you don't need to beat anyone up over that, right? Just because they missed that. So
yeah, I 100% agree. I also think that's like with forecasting, the goal is to make it be as accurate as possible. But the reality is, like, we get this question a lot, like, well, how accurate are your forecasts? And it's like, well, we're always going to be wrong to some degree. I wish we could always be right. And the truth is like, for some brands that have a lot of historical data and really high LTV, it's not infrequent for us to get within a few percent. For a brand that is very first-time customer dominant and growing a lot, like, it's not uncommon for us to be very, very wrong, especially as you extrapolate like very distant into the future. And that's why I just think it's important to have an open communication about it. And when I say accountability, I don't necessarily mean like, oh, you're responsible for either this being beat or missed. It's more so like you're responsible for managing the forecast. So how are we going to then change it for the future to make sure we're modeling it off of the right data? I 100% agree there. One of the funniest instances I can ever think of was we were working with a brand, and the first month we ever did a forecast for them, it may have been down to the dollar. We estimated their net sales accurately. And they were like blown away. And I was just like, this is almost a bad thing. I'm like, this will not happen.
No, you
again.
Set the bar too high in the first month,
like,
dude.
It's like, I think I said, I was like, a broken clock is right once a day. Like, not going to happen again. It was close. It was really, really close, but it was funny. It was one of the funniest meetings because like, I remember I was like, I don't put the reports together. Our team was putting the report together, and I got it before the meeting, and I was like, I thought it was right? Wrong.
Yeah. That's awesome, man. Well, what final thoughts do you have on planning processes before we land the plane on this one?
I think that for smaller brands, if you're getting too into the weeds, think to yourself, is this a decision-making framework that a brand 5 to 10 times my size would make? And in reality, sometimes you have to make a shorter term decision due to a current cash flow reality. But I see too often people narrowing in on too small of a time frame that's not statistically significant. So that's one piece. And then for the bigger brands that are healthier, I think annual planning is useful and it's productive. And you should I think a lot of businesses operate with a 12-month goal in mind. But oftentimes the way in which you get there is being willing to manipulate and change your monthly and quarterly plans. And I think most businesses should live in monthly and quarterly plans. I think weekly check-ins are important. The annual plan matters, but really and truly, like, once you start getting much shorter than monthly, it can be like a little trap. It's like a shiny object sometimes. Not always, but often.
Totally. My final thoughts are, you just need to be clear. Whatever planning time horizon you're working on, it's like, do I need to act on this? Should I act on this? So much of it is like, just understand if you're planning for insights or if you're planning to take action. If you can do that well, like you're gonna do better than most brands. And then the second takeaway that I just want to make sure everyone hears is, it's okay to adjust. Your plan is your plan. It's not the public markets plan. It's not your board's plan. Most of the time, it's your plan. If you find a good reason to adjust it based on learnings, adjust it and just keep executing towards a new plan. So anyways, I think that one's a wrap, man. That was a good one.
Boom. One more closer to 25, Jon.
Let's go.